Canada's most valued natural resources.
The focus has turned to our water supply.
Trump threatened to tear up the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. Water, already a precious commodity, is increasingly a point of contention between Canada and the U.S.
We have millions of gallons of water pouring down from the north with the snow caps in Canada and all pouring down. And they have essentially a very large faucet.
Breaking news. Donald Trump unleashes a new demand. Redirect Canada's fresh water to save America. The U.S., parched and rattled, reels in disbelief. While President Carney holds firm at the border, Washington's grips tighten over rivers, lakes, and a nation's survival. America's rattled by a new Trump bombshell, demanding Canada's water like it's a cold asset ready to tap. Just weeks earlier, Trump had already unleashed sweeping tariffs on steel, lumber, and vehicles, sparking a trade war that rattled U.S. industries and fueled Carney's rise in Ottawa. Trump's hunger for Canadian resources shifted from whispers to headlines, threatening treaties and splintering long-standing trade norms. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, a former central banker turned populist symbol of resistance, emerged pointing at a sharp shift. The trade pact's stalwart U.S.-Canada relationship is now broken. Dash in Canada is ready to stiff-arm America at the border. Before we go on, hit the like button and subscribe. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Let's dive in. Just hours ago, President Trump escalated the most audacious water play in U.S. history, calling Canada's rivers a very large faucet and demanding it be turned on to ease American droughts. This isn't rhetoric. He specifically eyed the Columbia River, 2,000 kilometers long with 800 kilometers flowing through BC, as a potential water pipeline to parched U.S. states, including California. At the same moment, the U.S. froze updates to the 1961 Columbia River Treaty, leaving decades of flood control and hydroelectric collaboration in limbo. Trump's intervention has brought treaty talks to a halt, signaling he's willing to weaponize water for leverage. Meanwhile, sources in Ottawa say environmental and Indigenous groups are sounding the alarm, backed by 85 organizations demanding unequivocal protection for Canada's freshwater sovereignty. Prime Minister Mark Carney has stepped in like a calm fortress, bluntly declaring Canada is not for sale and warning that the U.S. doesn't have the right to auction our water. That's the core. Trump pressing a resource-strapped U.S. for Canadian water. Carney digging in, and a long-trusted treaty now broken and watched by the entire world. For America, the fallout is immediate, and it cuts deep. The White House framed Trump's demand for Canadian water as a lifeline, a quick fix for drought-stricken states and industries struggling under pressure. But instead of relief, what followed was chaos. By pressing Ottawa so aggressively, Washington has triggered a domino effect that now threatens jobs, supply chains, and household stability across the United States. The first shock landed in the western states. California, Arizona, and Nevada, regions already in crisis from historic drought, had been banking on Trump's promise that new water supplies would be secured through negotiation. Farmers in the Central Valley were told that Canadian diversions might eventually keep fields alive, prevent mass crop losses, and bring stability to food prices. Instead, Carney's refusal shut the door. Overnight, confidence in Washington's water plan collapsed, leaving growers staring at dry canals, reduced irrigation allotments, and a wall of uncertainty. For U.S. agriculture, the numbers are staggering. Nearly 40% of America's vegetables and 2/3 of its fruits and nuts come from California's fields. Without additional supply, costs surge. Supermarket shelves already show higher prices, and projections now warn of double-digit increases in staples like lettuce, almonds, and tomatoes before year's end. Beyond agriculture, the blow spreads into America's industrial heartlands. Trump singled out water not just for farms, but for industry, computer chip fabrication in Arizona, hydro-appendant manufacturing in the Midwest, and energy production facilities scattered across the Rockies and Pacific Northwest. These sectors rely on constant high-volume access to clean water. When shortages bite, the impact is immediate. Slowed production, layoffs, and mounting costs. Analysts estimate that a single major semiconductor plant consumes up to 10 million gallons of water per day. Without relief, those plants are now rationing, cutting shifts, and warning of production delays that ripple into electronics, vehicles, and defense systems. The White House promised that diverting Canadian rivers would stabilize these supply lines. Now, instead, American workers are bracing for cuts. Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin states that form the U.S. manufacturing belt have already seen order delays and furloughs. Water-intensive sectors like steel and auto production, once the bedrock of Trump's economic pitch, are now being squeezed by a crisis Washington cannot solve with tariffs or threats. Energy markets tell a similar story. Hydroelectric plants in the Pacific Northwest were eyeing Canadian water as part of their contingency planning to handle peak demand during heat waves. With reservoirs at historic lows, utilities are turning back to coal and natural gas to fill the gap. Consumers see the result in climbing bills, while climate advocates warn of a dangerous reversal away from cleaner energy. In effect, the failure to secure water imports forces America into more expensive, dirtier stopgaps. Politically, the fallout is explosive. Trump's pitch was that America could no longer afford to be weak or beholden to neighbors. That U.S. power meant U.S. control over resources. By targeting Canadian water, he aimed to show dominance. Instead, he has run into a wall of resistance from Ottawa, and the optics are devastating. To his base, Trump insists Canada is hoarding rivers that should flow south. But to many in Washington, the spectacle looks like overreach, an attempt to claim what does not belong to the U.S., leaving America humiliated when Canada said no. The shock reaches deep into border states as well. Communities along the Great Lakes have been told repeatedly that agreements with Canada ensured fair sharing and stability. Trump's threats to tear up the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement shattered that assumption. For 40 million Americans who rely on the lakes for drinking water, any hint of instability raises alarm. Cities from Chicago to Cleveland are now grappling with the possibility that long-rusted crossbar accords could collapse, leaving one of the world's largest freshwater systems vulnerable to political brinkmanship. Wall Street has not missed the signal. Investors are already treating water security as a risk factor for U.S. industries, placing downward pressure on companies heavily dependent on high-volume, low-cost supplies. Agribusiness stocks dipped sharply following Carney's rejection, and analysts warned that manufacturing and tech could be next. In a climate where every gallon matters, uncertainty translates directly into volatility. For U.S. consumers, that volatility means higher costs, not just for food, but for cars, electronics, and power bills. Meanwhile, Canada's resolve under Carney underscores another uncomfortable truth. America no longer calls all the shots. For decades, Washington assumed Canadian resources were a fallback, a friendly cushion that could always be tapped in times of crisis. That assumption is gone. Carney's flat refusal demonstrates that Canada is willing to take the short-term pain of U.S. retaliation in order to secure long-term sovereignty. And the more he resists, the more American vulnerabilities are exposed. The human cost is equally severe across the U.S. Layoffs are mounting in water-intensive industries. Agricultural workers in California, factory employees in the Midwest, and even engineers in Arizona's high-tech sector are all bracing for uncertainty. Each job cut translates into political pressure as communities once promised relief under Trump's plan now feel abandoned. Town halls are erupting with anger. Governors are demanding clarity, and congressional delegations from both parties are pressing the administration for solutions. For everyday Americans, the impact is visible and personal. Water bills are climbing, grocery prices are spiking, and energy costs continue to rise. Families in drought-stricken regions now wonder how long their taps will run. Farmers are weighing whether to abandon fields. Manufacturers are debating whether to relocate plants abroad. All of it feeds into a sense of instability that Washington has not yet contained. This is the crux of the crisis. Trump demanded Canadian water to secure American prosperity. Canada refused. Now the U.S. faces a cascade of consequences, economic, political, and social that no amount of rhetoric can disguise. The very large faucet Trump described has not been opened. Instead, it has been shut tight, and with it, America's assumption of control over its northern neighbors' resources, and the shock is spreading. The longer the standoff drags on, the more deeply it undermines U.S. credibility, both at home and abroad. For miners in West Virginia, steel workers in Ohio, farmers in California, and families across the Midwest, the message is painfully clear. Without Canada's cooperation, America's water future looks uncertain, its industries unstable, and its leadership shaken. Underneath the political spectacle of Trump's demand and Carney's refusal lies a deeper story. Water has stealthily emerged as the most strategic 21st century commodity. If the 20th century was defined by oil, it is water that countries now quantify, stockpile, and battle for. For decades, It was comforting for the United States to know that its northern border has almost a fifth of the planet's fresh water. Canada's rivers, lakes, and glaciers appeared to ensure that, even when shortages grew extreme, America would never actually run out. That belief has now been broken, and the implications reach far beyond Washington and Ottawa. Around the world, water insecurity is reshaping geopolitics in ways reminiscent of the energy crises of the past. From the Mekong to the Euphrates, governments are fighting over who commands the flow. In pushing Canada so visibly, President Trump has inadvertently heightened Ottawa's stakes in this competition. Rather than continue as the quiet behind-the-scenes supplier to the American economy, Canada is now framed as the guardian of one of the world's most essential resources. This serves to give Ottawa greater bargaining power in trade negotiations not just with Washington, but also with Europe and Asia, where water scarcity is a matter of survival. Take the Columbia River Treaty. Inked in 1961, it was hailed as a paradigm of binational cooperation, reconciling U.S. flood control with Canadian hydroelectric dividends and defusing border tension. For decades, it was never a story in the news. Today, by putting its renegotiation on ice, Trump has made it a global signal. The world's greatest power will blow up a 60-year-old agreement over water. To friends and foes alike, that message is clear. If treaties are disposable, then new alliances will need to be negotiated. And Canada is suddenly a partner wooed not merely for timber, oil, or minerals, but for the one resource no economy can operate without. The Great Lakes themselves carry additional significance. This huge watershed sustains 40 million individuals and accounts for one-third of Canada's GDP and hundreds of billions of U.S. wages. Its integrity compromised, the consequences are felt around the world. Duluth to Montreal shipping routes transport iron, ore, grain, and manufacture products fueling supply chains serving Europe, Africa, and Asia. When Trump threatened to upend the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, he was not merely shaking Canadian nerves. He was sending a signal to global markets that even North America's most stable freshwater corridor is politicizable. That uncertainty alone will be sufficient to send global investors into a panic and steer money away from territories perceived to be less certain. China and the European Union already are. Beijing has long sought ways to control resource corridors from African minerals to Central Asian pipelines. Rumors in diplomatic circles today are that Chinese companies are considering investment in Canadian water management facilities, offering capital in return for future guarantees of supply in low-key deals. Policymakers in Brussels, worried about drought affecting southern Europe, have started to outline longer-term trading arrangements that consider Canada as a fallback source for Europe's agricultural water requirements. To the ears of Americans, such a situation might sound remote, even impossible. But the pages of history illustrate how rapidly markets can change when a commodity becomes politicized. In the 1970s, few thought oil would ever be used as a weapon, until the OPEC embargo rewrote the rules of the global system overnight. Now water has the same potential. By standing up to Trump so strongly, Prime Minister Carney has defended Canadian sovereignty, yes, but also declared to the world that Canada is a sovereign water power that can determine where and how its rivers flow. For the United States, this fact creates new vulnerabilities. If Canada further engages with Asia or Europe in ways that privilege water-intensive exports, American industries will bear greater costs and diminished access. That risk is compounded by climate change. Every year, drought advances further into the U.S. West, aquifers drop lower, and the need for water-hungry products like semiconductors and electric vehicle batteries increases greater. Here, America's presumption of automatic Canadian water access is not merely out of date, it is perilous. The symbolic defeat also echoes through Washington's alliances. NATO has always been defined in terms of military cooperation, but resources count, too. When an American president openly threatens a close ally for water, it undercuts trust throughout the alliance. European leaders, already dubious of U.S. dependability, now have another data point. If Trump can destabilize Canada for rivers and lakes, why can't he weaponize other deals elsewhere? That perception diminishes Washington's moral standing at a moment when the U.S. is seeking to balance Russia in the Arctic and China in the Pacific. At home, the message is more somber. Americans long have assumed their nation, blessed with huge rivers and lakes, was insulated from the type of resource warfare that plagues other parts of the world. But Trump's request for Canadian water indicates how tenuous that security has grown. If the U.S. can't ensure supply within its own country, then its role as global leader is on weaker ground than most people appreciate. The economic interests are beyond old-fashioned industries. Water shortage jeopardizes America's competitiveness in the very technologies it asserts will shape the future. Electric vehicle batteries, cutting-edge computer chips, hydrogen power, all consume vast amounts of water throughout production. If the United States is not able to secure stable flows while Canada and other countries move to lock up long-term reserves, America will lag behind in the competition for clean tech supremacy. That transition would impact not just employment and exports, but Washington's capacity to influence world standards in new industries. The optics elsewhere are just as dramatic. Canada's insubordination under Carney has already provoked debate in capitals ranging from Berlin to Tokyo. In Europe, experts describe Ottawa's resistance as evidence that middle powers are able to push back against Washington's pressure when it is coming from a position of strength and resources. In Asia, governments struggling with their own water shortages see in Canada a possible ally resistant to U.S. diktats. For America's competitors, most notably China, the standoff offers an opportunity to claim that U.S. leadership is weakening and that other countries need to seek alternatives for reliable partnerships. Geopolitical charts do not always shift suddenly, but attitudes do. The photo of Trump insisting Canada's rivers as if property, and Carney bluntly refusing, embodies a new narrative. The United States is no longer entitled to automatic deference from closest allies. This perception emboldens others, from Mexico considering alternate trade routes to Arctic states recalculating as climate change opens up new waters and resources. The Arctic is particularly sensitive. As ice melts, shipping routes and resource basins previously off-limits are up for grabs. Canada, with its immense northern landmass, already has a stake in projecting authority over it. By linking Trump's water needs to larger resource conflicts, Carney sends a message to Moscow and Beijing. Canada will protect its natural riches even against Washington's pressure. In turn, the U.S. risks being viewed as unstable, undermining its credibility when urging allies to stand firm against Russian or Chinese encroachment. The ripple effects reach financial markets, too. Global investors interpret the confrontation not merely as a bilateral spat, but as evidence of rising political risk in North America. That perception matters. If capital flows shift to Canadian infrastructure and out of U.S. projects reliant on stable cross-border resources, Washington may experience greater borrowing costs and decreased investment at home. Already, Chicago water futures are trading at record levels, a sign that worry about drought and politics is clashing in ways the U.S. government cannot easily sway. In this context, the U.S. Canada water showdown is not merely one of rivers and lakes. It is a matter of credibility, of leadership, and of the balance of power. It is a world in which climate and scarcity are reconfiguring every alliance, and Canada's rebellion serves notice that America's closest ally will no longer bend when its sovereignty is questioned. To the United States, the surprise is not that it can't have Canadian water. The deeper shock is that the era of automatic compliance by allies is at an end, and that a new epoch of disputed resources has dawned. Ahead, the confrontation between Washington and Ottawa is more than an interim diplomatic spat. It is the initial act of what may prove to be one of the defining geopolitical battles of the next decade. Who owns North America's water, and on what terms? The decisions today will have repercussions for generations. For the United States, things look bleak unless tactics change. Trump's tough talk, insisting on Canadian water as if it were a commodity to be bid on, has boxed in his government. If Ottawa doesn't yield, Washington is faced with deciding whether to escalate with tariffs, court action, or even unilateral diversions. All of those avenues come with danger. Tariffs precipitate retaliation in wood, steel, and energy markets, penalizing American consumers. Lawful battles through international courts are long and unpredictable, and unilaterally sponsored diversion projects, even if theoretically feasible, would inflame relations and invite outright confrontation with Canada. Canada's path, in the meantime, appears more self-assured. By insisting, Prime Minister Carney has established a precedent. Water is a sovereign resource, not a negotiating tool. That stance is extremely popular with Canadians on all sides of the political divide, so that it will be politically impossible for any future government to cave to American pressure. Within Canada, Ottawa is likely to expedite new federal safeguards for rivers and lakes, taking water policy out of the decentralized provincial system and into a national regime crafted specifically to deflect outside pressure. If enacted, these laws would effectively close the faucet Trump opened, making future shortcuts even more difficult. The business community is already preparing for the consequences. American agribusiness companies are warning that without other sources of water, crop losses could worsen. Manufacturing and tech leaders are calling for huge federal investments in desalination, wastewater reuse, and aquifer recharge. These technologies are available, but expanding them will cost trillions of dollars and take years of building. In the meantime, industries are vulnerable and downsizings are likely to accumulate. Energy firms, also, have tough decisions to make. When hydroelectric currents are under pressure, utilities might turn increasingly toward fossil fuels to make up for the difference, running counter to America's climate commitments. Globally, the water confrontation reconfigures alliances. Expect Canada to intensify relations with Europe and Asia by using its freshwater resources as diplomatic capital. Already, there are whispers in Brussels that European diplomats will ask for water-related provisions in coming trade agreements with Ottawa. In Asia, drought-stricken nations are bound to see Canada as a strategic long-term ally, possibly providing investments in return for sure access to Canadian farm goods. Each move in that direction diminishes Washington's leverage and solidifies Canada's role as a world water power. For ordinary Americans, the implications are obvious. Grocery prices are going up, energy prices are rising, and trust in Washington to provide answers is dwindling. If no action is taken, the political fallout could be dire. Voters in crucial swing states aligned with agriculture, manufacturing, and the Great Lakes might convert their anger into electoral blowback. Trump vowed prosperity through toughness. Instead, his tussle with Canada has revealed vulnerability, and time is running short. Climate projections predict that by 2030, much of the U.S. West will endure crippling, extended droughts unlike anything in recent history. Without Canadian cooperation, the U.S. will have to depend on domestic conservation and technological ingenuity, measures that could prove too expensive and too time-consuming to avert sweeping disruption. The future, therefore, depends upon a harsh alternative: double down on confrontation or switch to compromise and innovation. Either course, the message from Ottawa has been sent with clarity. See, Ottawa's water won't run south just because Washington wants it. And for America, that denial is the beginning of a new era, one where survival, prosperity, and leadership hinge not on domination, but on accommodation. This water war is no longer behind-the-scenes policy dispute. It's headline news, an all-or-nothing struggle that will determine America's future. Trump demanded Washington's rivers as if they were Canada's to command. Carney stood firm, drawing a line that shocked U.S. officials and left the world waiting. For America, the shock is real and the price is just starting. If you enjoyed this analysis, give it a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next in-depth look at the global forces recasting markets, resources, and America's position in the world. From tariffs to treaties, from water to energy, here's where the future is being made. Tune in.